Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Amina Al-Din with Critical Talk for Muslim Network TV. And this evening, I thought I would bring it to the attention of many who haven't had a chance to follow the research that Pew and ISPU is doing on Muslim communities. So I have the honor of talking with Dr. Besheer Mohamed, who is a senior researcher at Pew Research Center, and he's an expert on the views, demographic profiles, and sizes of U.S. Muslim communities. But before we get to the actual research, I thought I would take an opportunity to talk about research. I keep all of these ex students of mine and current graduate students talking about, I want to do research. I don't think they have a clue. Welcome. Salaam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for having me on. As one of your former graduate students,
Uh-huh.
you helped me really start to think about this in a careful and critical way about what research is, what it entails, and just how difficult it can be.
hmm Well, talk about it. How do first of all, let me see. I don't know the order in which I should ask this. What, how, where, when should people do research? What is actual research? There's quantitative research and there's qualitative research. So let's first distinguish between the two.
Sure. So I'll actually take a step a little bit even before that and say, one of the I work sort of professionally as a researcher at the Pew Research Center. I've been there for about 10 years. Before that, I was a fellow at ISPU. And one of the things that I've really been trying to do is bring research to bear on questions, issues, topics related to Muslim Americans, things that the Muslim American community is wrestling with, or in some other cases, things that helping the public understand Muslim Americans, with the assumption that research can serve a role in helping people get past their just sort of first intuitions. What am I happening? Who are the people around me? What are they saying? They're sort of echo chambers, and give them a better sense of, okay, well, so this is your experience, and that's valuable and valid, but that doesn't mean it's generalizable. That doesn't mean that other people are having the same sort of experience. And so quantitative research tends to be focused on this sort of generalizability. Like, how can we get a broad enough frame of reference, a broad enough sample, enough people of a diverse enough sort of varied backgrounds, et cetera, to be able to say, how common a given pattern is, how common a given view is. And that might be anything from how many Muslims are there in the United States. Like, this is something you can only figure out with research. Or, what do Muslims think about a given issue? Or how many Muslims are going to the mosque? You're not going to figure that out going to the mosque, right? If you're going to the mosque, that's not how you find out how many Muslims are going to the mosque. And so quantitative research is generally at trying to answer those sorts of questions, where the answer is some number. You can say, there's this many million Muslims in the United States, or this percentage of Muslims, go to the mosque regularly. Whereas qualitative research tends to be more focused on sort of unpacking nuance, on getting an understanding, really sort of digging into the details of experiences and seeing, well, what are the patterns, what are the reasons, why are these things happening? And so quantitative research often is the most common type of quantitative research, and what I probably do the most of is surveys, where you design a set of questions that people can answer with, A, B, C, D. It's this or it's this. How often do you do it? Pick from a list, and then you give that to a representative sample, do some statistical magic, and then you can say, this is what we know about the public. or this is what we know about Muslims. But then qualitative research is really more about doing one-on-one interviews, doing focus groups, doing, where you have a small group of people, 3, 5, 7 people in a room, and you sort of have facilitator have them walk through a specific set of questions, or even ethnography, where sometimes you're sort of noticing patterns in a careful way, just by sort of being present. And so all those qualitative tools are generally focused at really understanding the whys, the mechanisms behind things.
So the penultimate, I'm going to ask you to scoot back a little bit from your camera so we don't lose you in your name. So the penultimate kind of research is a little bit of both.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think they both have strengths, and they both have limitations. And so you really, it's a little bit of both, but I'd say even more than that, what the right tool is. These are all tools. What the right research tool is depends on what your research question is.
Well, let's go there, since I've been there with you before. How does one decide what a research question is?
So, I mean, I think in the general sense, a research question can be anything that you're interested in, that you think there is a specific answer to. So a research question would not be, do I like this or this? That's just a preference, right? I happen to have this or this. You can't really research that. But if you wanted to know, how many quarts of strawberry ice cream are eaten in a given week or month, like you could research that. You could get the answer. That's a question that there is an answer to that you could research. And individuals and organizations, have questions, come up with questions that they think are worthy of the investment that it takes to come up with the answer. Now, at the Pew Research Center where I work, we have a process every year where, as an organization, we really sort of stop and think, well, what are the questions that we as an institution, as an organization, are going to try to answer this year? So broadly speaking, the Pew Research Center operates with the assumption that we can use our tools, our research, our experience to answer questions. And because we're not, we don't have to go for sort of individual grants for everything. Most of our funding comes from our parent organization, the Pew Charitable Trusts. And they don't require us to say, well, I want $50,000 for this study and $100,000 for this study. And they just say, we're going to give you, a grant for the year to go do good research.
Yeah.
And so we go.
Nice.
It is. It's a phenomenal. It's a phenomenal privilege. But then, we have to say, okay, well, what is the good research we can do? What are the topics that nobody else is going to do because nobody else is putting the money into it? What are the questions that we think the public is wrestling with that really nobody else is going to answer? So here we go. We can answer this question. I've had the privilege to work on 2 surveys of the Muslim American community while I've been at the Pew Research Center, and Pew's done 3 or 4 of them in total. And it's just that sort of topic where they recognize that the public in general really is making all sorts of crazy assumptions about, well, Muslims, they're this and they're this, and that Muslims hate America, and Muslims are all Arab, and Muslims are, and they're like, you know what? Those are research questions that we can answer, and nobody else is doing it. So let's step in and let's answer those questions.
Okay, so after you bite the bullet and write out a list of possibilities for a research question, I think what you're telling me is that among the most compelling are the ones you're going to see what you can do with. Then say we're going to do quantitative data. First, what tools do I need at my disposal after I collect this data to make it work, to spew out all those darn charts and graphs and numbers. But then what other tools do I need?
So, there's the tools in terms of, if it's a survey, in terms of sort of questionnaire design, which is, how do you ask a question so that people, a broad range of people, can understand the question in the same way and can give you an answer that's clear and that isn't leading, right? And that doesn't kind of scare people off. I'll give you a sort of simple example that's a little silly, but is also real. So we did a study in 2017 where we were surveying Muslim Americans, right? And 2017, we did it sort of in 2016, 2017. 2017, this was not a time, the Muslim community was kind of nervous, right? There was a lot going on. And the community really wasn't in a particularly trusting state. And so, we're thinking one of the just sort of basic, we want to know, just to start off, well, how many Muslims are there? And so we've got to get people, and the way that we define this, the way we analyze this, is we ask people to identify themselves. We don't say like, we're going to tell you that you're Muslim because of this or that or the other. If you tell us you're Muslim, that's what it means that you're Muslim. If you tell us you're not Muslim, then you're not Muslim. We say, oh, well, their parents are Muslim and they're from this. If they say they're not Muslim, they're not Muslim. We're done. Like, that's how we look at it. But, if you're in a situation where people are sort of cautious and hesitant, even asking people their religious identity, you have to be careful. So, there was an organization a little bit before we did our study that had and turned out that this was a Muslim organization, but they were trying to identify Muslims and reach out to them for their purposes, and they had a sort of robocall that just said, press 1 if you're Muslim, press 2 if you're not. And
sorry, that's just funny.
And what happened was, predictably, what they didn't get was an accurate description of people saying, oh, I'm going to press 1 and tell you I'm Muslim. What they got was a lot of people hanging up the phone, whether they were Muslim or not. They got a lot of people. They got Muslims calling various national organizations, calling CARE and be like, we're getting these calls. People are asking if we're Muslim, what's going on. And eventually it was shown like, actually, no, this was a Muslim organization trying to collect, to work with the community, but doing it in a way that sort of put people's hackles up and got them nervous. The way that we approached the question, it wasn't a one question. We didn't ask people's religious identity until we had been talking to them for a few minutes. So we'd gotten a chance to build rapport, explain who we are, why we're talking to you. And then we didn't just single people out. We didn't say like, are you Muslim? We just said, what is your religious identity? And there was a list of 8 or 10 different possibilities, and Muslim was one of them, but so was Christian and Jewish and Hindu. And so people didn't feel as like, oh, well, what are they doing? Why are they asking? So the combination of taking the time to explain what we were doing and also not really singling people out meant that we were able to avoid a lot of that. We didn't get a lot of folks just sort of hanging up when they started asking their religious identity. We didn't get people calling CARE and ISNA and saying, oh, people are calling me. And so even something as simple as that, how you ask the question is, for a lot of these questions, is very important. And then once you ask the question.
What you're also saying is that politics and the political climate, at least the political climate, perhaps also the social climate, but maybe even the religious climate, plays a great deal in if you're doing research on religious communities.
Oh, absolutely. You have to be aware of what's going on, what people are reacting to, what's the context that people are in. And that goes back to the point that I was alluding to earlier, that a lot of us nowadays are in sort of insulated bubbles, right? We sort of talk to people that are similar to us. We're on social media with people that are similar to us. And but the point of quantitative research is to get past that. But
Mm.
you have to know enough to say, oh, I'm going to be feeling some kind of way at this. And so be careful. And so, you know, as an organization, make sure that we have this sort of diversity of voices at the table to help us see these sorts of pitfalls.
Right, right. Awesome, awesome. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk about the how of research after you get the questions. This is
Mhm.
Dr. Abigail Dean for Critical Talk. I'm having a wonderful time with Dr. Besheer Mohamed, who I think may still be on the board of ISPU, but definitely is a senior researcher at Pew Research Center. We'll be right back. Maybe. Wake up, Sherdil.
Commercial break.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Amna Al-Din, and I'm talking with Dr. Besheer Mohamed about research, studies from Pew, studies from ISPU, and really getting to the nitty gritty of how one tackles research. So now I have my question. I've been very careful about how I ask it. I have made sure I'm aware of things that would mitigate the person getting into a conversation with me by paying attention to, I don't know, the political scene, the social scene, whatever. What do I do next?
Statistics, math,
Oh, God.
lots of statistics and math. The next three steps are all different types of statistics and math. Uh, um, you know, that this is the part that my students love so much.
Yep.
But no, like that the reality is that the next things you've got to do are all governed by you know, statistical rules, things like the central limit theorem, and all, which basically all have to do with the fact that you are going to talk to a relatively small number of people. 500, 1,000, 2,000, maybe 5,000 if it's a really big study, people. And then you're going to try to make assertions about millions of people. You're going to say, I talked to 5,000 people, and now this is what millions of people that are like them think or are represented by in various ways.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way you can do that responsibly is if you're very careful with the statistical method there's all kinds of mathematical proofs that people can go into as to why it works. But ultimately, if you're careful and in making sure that your initial group is sort of random and representative, then you can say, we're only looking at a small piece of that group, but it will represent the whole. For example, if you're, if you're cooking and you've got a pot of soup, you're not going to drink the whole pot of soup to find out whether or not it needs more salt, right? And you don't need to. You can sample. You can as long as your pot is stirred, you've stirred it up real well, you can take a spoonful of soup and be like, yep, this is good.
That's a great example.
This needs more salt, or this needs less salt. As long as you've stirred it up real well. And that stirring process is the statistics. And if you've done that right, then you can say, okay, I've got my spoonful of soup and I know it's just a spoonful. I know it's just 1,000 people, but I've been real careful. And so I know that 1,000 people can stand in for this much larger group.
So what computational tools are available for folk to sort through that? We get medians and means and all the stuff I hate to read, and I hate even more to do it, but I hate to read it. What computational software or whatever is there?
So there are a few statistical programs that do a lot of the work for you. SPSS, Stata, R, SAS are the names of a couple of these big programs that people use. But aside from the programs, there are just sort of statistical formulas and models and rules that help you. So, for example, the central limit theorem tells you, broadly speaking, how many people you have to have what degree of certainty. So, when you look at statistics, often they have what's called a margin of error. They'll say, this is 70% and the margin of error is ±3 or ±5 or plus whatever it is. And that comes from this central limit theorem. It comes from this underlying mathematical data that we have that says that if you have 500 people, then it looks like this. If you have 1,000, then the margin of error is this. If you have 1,000, the margin of error is this. If you have 10,000, the margin of error is this. And it's all about, how certain you are that your small group can stand in for that larger group. That's what that margin of error speaks to. So that's one piece. Yeah.
How about that? I just look at it and say, oh, that's too big. Let me go back. But I've always had students who figure they can do, because it sounds good, quantitative research on 5 people that they interviewed about something, or 60 people. And I'm saying that's not enough people.
No, that's not. I mean, there are really 2 issues with that. One is that's not enough people. If you go in and you look at the statistics and the margin of error, you probably got a margin of error of 20.
Yeah,
and so you're like, the percentage is 40 with a margin of error of plus or minus 20, which means we don't know. It's somewhere between 20% and 60%. Like, well, you're not telling me anything at that point. So that's the first issue, is that the margin of error is going to be too big. But the other issue is that usually when you have that situation, the people you've picked aren't random. And so you didn't stir the pot yet. Your pot isn't stirred properly.
Right.
And so that could be an issue. I can interview 5,000 people at ISNA, and I still can't make any generalizations about the Muslim population, because and I'll ask them, how often do you go to ISNA? I asked 5,000 people at ISNA how often they go to ISNA. They all say that they go to ISNA at least once every few years. I'm like, oh, all Muslims go to ISNA at least every few years. Well, no, you were at ISNA. It don't matter how many people you talk to.
Right.
That's not a good sample. And so there's 2 pieces to it. One is that sample, and the other is the size.
Right. Has to have the size. So let's move to, I know you've been involved I think, at least with one of Pew's sampling of Muslims.
Mhm.
I have never been called. I'm here to say, probably would have hung up if I had been called. But anyway, never been called. But when I look at the questions, they are reasonable questions. But I'm saying, who is answering these questions in this way? Where are these people come from? How do you track down the people that to interview?
So the way that we do it primarily is, and this is actually the way that we've done almost all of our surveys up until a few years ago. We're starting to shift away, is random digit phone dialing, which means, and it's a little more complicated this, but basically means you pick up the phone and you say, well, let's try 773-123-4567. See who picks up the phone. What about 1-2-3-4-5-6-7-8-9 or 5-6-8? See who picks up the phone. And you do that, and you keep doing that. And when they pick up the phone, you ask them a series of questions. And like I said, whether or not they're Muslim is one of those questions, but it's not the first question, and it's asked in a very specific way. But you ask them, how are things going in your life today? You ask them, what do you think about, the political environment? What do you think about President Trump? Maybe. Well, that's probably not the first question you ask, but you ask a set of questions. What do you think about, how's your financial situation? Whatever it is, I'd have to look at exactly. You ask a set of questions, and then you ask these questions about, what's your religious identity. You ask race. You consider it black or white or Hispanic or Arab or whatever it is. And you ask their religious identity. Like I said, it's sort of a list of options. See which ones they pick. Now, if they say that they're Muslim, and if it's the study of Muslims, then if they say that they're Muslim, you say, okay, well, we'd like to, there's the Pew Research Center does studies of lots of religious groups. We're currently trying to do a study of Muslims, and we'd like to ask you some additional questions. And then you jump into the Muslim-specific content. You start asking about, how often do you go to the mosque? You ask about views toward whether Islam should be, traditional, just Islam needs to be updated. I don't remember exactly how it works, but traditional understandings of Islam sufficient for the modern age. You ask how often do they pray? And, you go through these questions that are specific to Muslims, some of which are religious, and some of them aren't. We ask social and political questions. We also, one of the questions that we asked in 2017 is whether people thought that the Democratic Party was friendly or unfriendly toward Muslims, whether they thought the Republican Party was friendly or unfriendly toward Muslims, whether they thought President Trump was friendly or unfriendly toward Muslims. So we ask a wide range of questions. Are you registered to vote? And then afterwards, after we've contacted enough people, enough Muslims, and incidentally, it requires calling something on the order of like 1 million numbers to have 1,000 complete interviews.
Did you say 1B like Beverly? Billion?
Million, no, M. Just 1 million, not a billion. Only 1 million.
1 million is a lot.
Yeah, but yeah, something on that order of phone numbers, and doing hundreds of thousands of what we call screening interviews. So interviews with people that we don't know if they're Muslim or not, because like we don't know if the person's Muslim until we ask them. It's not like we have a list. We're like, oh, this is the mosque list. These are the people that are Muslim, or like these are the people whose name are Mohamed and Eldin. They're Muslim. We don't know who is or isn't going to be Muslim until we call. And so most of the people we talk to aren't Muslim. And so, but we're interested in the study of Muslims. We're like, okay, that's great. We get to the religion question. You say you're Christian and have a nice day. We don't need to know anything else about you. um, and
Well,
so, yeah.
how many people are doing all this calling, or is it an automated system
Oh, it's people.
of some
It's
sort?
people. It's people.
Are you
Uh,
kidding me?
it's people that we contract. There are organizations that do this, that have what's called call centers. I actually worked at one of them when I was in grad school, so I know exactly how this works. But yeah, there are organizations that have just rooms full of people that have phones and computers, and the computer will just say, like, here's the next number you're calling. Uh, and then they'll call and they'll say hello, and they'll hope that somebody picks up so they can go through their list of questions. And
Right.
sometimes they don't.
Mm.
Sometimes the person, they have these people who that's their job, and there are dozens or hundreds of people whose job is to make these phone calls
Mm.
and to go through these questionnaires to ask these questions that we've carefully designed.
Wow. So let's take the rest of our time to talk about what do we actually know about Muslims in the United States.
Sure, sure. Um, so we know a lot. Uh, we have good information on how many Muslims there are in the U.S. It's somewhere in the range of about 4 million, a
How
bit
many?
more, about 4 million.
Okay.
So a bit more than 1% of the population of the U.S. is Muslim, um, although they're not evenly distributed. So if you're living in Dearborn, Michigan, or New York or parts of Chicago, you'll swear up and down it's got to be more than that, um, because in those communities it is.
Hmm.
But then there are other parts of the country where there just aren't very many Muslims, and so it averages out to something on that number, on that range. We know that about half, a bit less than half of Muslims in the United States say that they attend religious services with some regularity. Um, we know that a similar share say that they really. Um, we know that some upwards of 80% of Muslims fast in Ramadan. So fasting in Ramadan is actually a more common practice, a more shared practice than daily prayer or attendance at the mosque
Going to
attendance.
masjid.
Um, um, you
That's
know,
interesting.
so we know those. We know some demographic things. We know some things about religion. Um, some of the work that I've done, looks specifically at African American Muslims, and we know that African American Muslims make up a smaller share of the Muslim population now than they did 20 or 40 years ago. It's
Mhm.
probably something on the range of 1 in 5 Muslims in the U.S. are Black, um, which
Yeah, does the Black include the Caribbean,
it does. It
Africa,
does.
and South
Um,
America?
well, possibly, usually not South America, because a lot of South American Muslims don't identify as Black. A lot of
Okay.
South Americans in general don't identify as Black, but includes like African immigrants, includes Caribbean immigrants, which are making up a growing share of
Hmm.
Blacks overall and of Black
Hmm.
Muslims. But really, there's no racial or ethnic group that's a majority in the United States,
Well,
which makes Muslims in the United States really different from Muslims really any place else.
uh-huh.
Um, in pretty much any country, whether it's a Muslim majority country or a Muslim or a country like you say Germany or
Hmm.
the UK,
Mm.
there's usually one racial or ethnic group that's the majority.
Right.
Um,
Mm.
and that's just not true in the United States. There are similar shares of South Asians, of Arabs, of African Americans, um, and
See?
so and then we've got, Iranians and Turks and
Right.
Malaysians. There's a lot of smaller groups, but even the largest groups don't make up majorities. There's just
Okay.
so that's one of those things that's really distinctive
So they
about
need to take
Muslims.
away that pie everybody keeps reproducing
Um,
in thirds. There's a pie
well,
where, yeah,
yeah, I mean, thirds would work if you assume that every single Muslim is either black or Arab or South Asian.
yeah, yeah.
But that's the only way you get thirds, right? Is because like that's it. That's your whole that's everybody. It's like, well, what about the Iranians? What about the Turks? What about the Malay? We're
Exactly.
forgetting all of them. What about the Caucasian convert? There's lots of other groups. Um,
So there was a survey done on Masajid, and I'm assuming that you're talking by ISPU recently. And then there was, I don't know if it was a paper or a survey that talked about the decline in African American Masajid. You want to
mhm.
talk just a little bit?
Sure. That was building on Professor Ihsan Bagby's work. He's done a series of these studies of mosques, basically every 10 years since 1990 or so.
Mm-hmm.
He's done these careful studies of both, how many masajid are there in the United States, and we've seen that number has been growing quite rapidly. Um, and then he calls, this goes back to the sampling, right? He calls a sample of those, and he and his team call a sample of them and ask them, tell me about your congregation, tell me about your community. What's the
Mm-hmm.
racial makeup? Do you
Mm-hmm.
have women on the board? So that
Mm-hmm.
they have a whole sort of carefully designed set of questions that they go through. And one of the things that they found was that uh, over this period, the 30 or 40 years they've been doing this, and especially in the last 10 years, that the number of African American masajid has declined. It's declined.
Significantly or just um, tipping downward?
I mean, it's not like, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. It's not like half. It's not like it's dropped by half.
Mm-hmm.
But it's significant. It's not like, well, it's in the margin of error and maybe it's going to tip back up. Like it's a steady pattern of it's been declining.
Oh,
Um, and it's actually similar to so that's a looking at the masajid. That's similar to the data that Pew gets when interviewing individuals,
mm-hmm.
where African Americans make up a smaller share of the Muslim population.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Where'd they go?
I mean, I think there are a few things going on, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that's going on is there are more Muslims. So when we're talking about shares, if there were, let me just pick a number. If there were 20 masajid out of 100, that would be 20%.
Right.
Now, if you kept those 20, but now there's 200 masajid, now it's only 10%.
I got you.
So part of what happened is just that the Muslim community has been growing. And that growth has mostly not been
Mm.
within the African American community.
Okay.
Um,
Let's take our last break. And I want you to continue that conversation. But I also want you to tell us what do we need to really know? How can we make sure that we're participating in these surveys or at least reading about them? This is Dr. Amina Al-Din. I'm with Dr. Besheer Mohamed, and we're discussing research, the art of research, because research is an art, and Mosque data. We'll be right back. Huh. Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr. Amina Al-Din with On Critical Talk from Muslim Network TV, and I'm having a heartbreaking, especially when you talk about statistics, conversation with Dr. Besheer Mohamed about what we know and what we don't know about mosques. Now, let me ask this. Has anybody ever tracked where the Muslims live who respond most frequently to surveys?
Yeah, yeah. Pew has done some work about looking at that in the effort of trying to make sure that our data doesn't wind up being biased, and in the effort of
Right.
making sure that it's not the case that, oh, we're really only these sorts of Muslims are responding and not these sort of Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the patterns that we see are similar to patterns that we see in the public overall. That, for example, people in urban areas often are less likely to take surveys. They, for whatever reason, there are various reasons sort of thrown out as to why that is, but folks in
Tired,
huh?
suspicious,
Mm-hmm,
tired,
mm-hmm,
suspicious.
mm-hmm,
Uh-huh.
so that's one pattern that we see. We also see patterns by I don't know, gender,
Mm-hmm.
age, old. In a lot of situations, um, older folks are more willing to give you the time to sit down and talk to you about
We
something.
don't have anything else to do.
Whereas younger folks are much more likely to be like, yeah, I ain't got time for this.
Exactly.
Um, so we definitely do see those patterns, and there are some statistical methods that we can do to try to address that, both in the public overall and among Muslims. This is where a concept called survey weighting comes in.
Survey waiting.
Yes, weighting.
Mm-hmm.
And people talk about using weights or weighting the data, and what they're talking about is correcting for these issues that we know exist and we know ways to fix them. So that's part of it. But I mean, I think the broader question, issue, I'm not sure what the right word is that for a long time the Muslim community has been skeptical
Mm-hmm.
of
And scared.
and scared and scared,
Yeah.
um, and just sort of not willing or interested in engaging. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that some of that is changing. I've been doing this kind of work for 15 years now, and I think some of that is changing. People are getting a little more willing to engage, a little more willing to believe that maybe data can help, maybe surveys can help, maybe studies can help. Um, I think that other communities are much further along than us
Mm-hmm.
in terms of really using and harnessing data to understand the community.
But also
Because
to get grants and some other things that they want. I hate to cut you short, but I'm going to give you the last 2-3 minutes to tell us what is it we need to know? What must we pay attention to? Where can we find that information? How regularly should we look? I'm looking all the time, but I'm on your list of getting notices.
I mean, I think there are a few organizations that are actively doing research on the Muslim community. Pew is doing work on this. ISPU is doing work on this. The Faith Communities Today organization that Professor Bagby works with is doing work on this. So I think there are a couple of specific organizations that are doing this sort of work that are worth paying attention to.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the reality is that more research is needed. I think the organizations, I think Pew does a great job at what it does. I think ISPU does a great job at what it does, but there's a gap. There's more that needs to be done.
Right.
And so, I mean, really what I'd like to see the community do, both individually and collectively, is look at these sources. Look at what Pew's done. Look at what ISPU's done. Look at the Mosque study, and see whether or not those questions are the questions that you wanted to know the answer to. And sometimes they will be, and sometimes they won't be. But if they aren't,
let you know.
Let us know and make it happen. Like, okay, what I really want to see is this. I feel like this is the question that hasn't been answered, that needs to be answered. And for those of you that have money, put the money into it.
Yeah.
This isn't necessarily a pitch for I want the money. I'd love the money. Don't get me wrong. But just in general,
Right.
good research takes money.
Yes.
And so if there are questions that you think are important, then
fund it.
Then fund it. Then those are questions that are worth putting the money behind, making sure you find out the answers and the right answers. Don't try to cut corners, because this is the other thing that you have. A lot of folks will be, oh well, well, what can we do for $50? Well, for $50, I can call 4 people and tell you what they think. But that's not a study. That's not data. So
that's not even qualitative stuff.
Right. Right.
Yeah. No, this has been very, very interesting, because continuing undergrad students, graduate students don't have a clue as to how to do research, what it takes. They bite off more than they can chew, and then try to backtrack and find out that they've kind of closed doors behind them in what they wanted to look at. It's also important, I think, for us to begin to track the stuff. I've always used both Pew and ISPU's data in my class, and students really find it helpful. They may have additional questions and this and that and the other, but at least they have a base from which to ask the questions.
Absolutely.
Having said that, I'm going to thank you, give you my salams, ask you to stay on. This is Dr. Amina Al-Din with Critical Talk for Muslim Network TV, and I have spent far too short a time talking with Dr. Besheer Mohamed, who is a senior researcher at Pew Research Center. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.